All right, we'll be starting soon. So right before we start, I have to give you some information here. After this speech, coffees and lunches will be served, but please, before that, you can attend the speech. So after the speech, there will be coffees and lunches served downstairs in the main hall, Salon Nobre, and in the grey hall, Salon Cinza. There will be also a photo panel and booth of universities New Zealand and Canada and Latin America research and exchange opportunities, Calareo, downstairs at the same place where we'll have lunch and coffee served. And if you take photos on the photo panel, you can post them on the FAUBAI social media with the hashtag FAUBAI. Don't miss the booth, don't miss the lunch, don't miss the coffees afterwards. And for now, for this plenary session, I'd like to call on stage our President José Celso Freires Jr. and our speaker, Samia Chasi.
Good morning. Welcome to the second day of the FAUBAI 2024 conference. It is a great pleasure to have you all with us today. I hope you enjoyed our opening plenary yesterday with one of Brazil's leading intellectuals. Towards the end of Professor Butch's presentation, he mentioned the brilliance of our universities comes not from what we know, but from what we want to know. In this spirit, we invite you today to the plenary session, Reimagining Internationalization from the Global South. May we be open-minded to a new vision proposed by two great current thinkers on the internationalization of higher education, Dr. Savo Eleta and Dr. Samia Chasi, who is here with us today. Dr. Chasi is a practitioner, scholar, and facilitator in higher education internationalization, with 25 years of experience in this field. She is currently the manager of strategic initiatives, partnerships, development, and research at the International Education Association of South Africa. Before joining IEASA, she worked in international offices of German and South African universities, an agency of the European Commission, as well as representations of the German Academic Exchange Service, DAAD, Nuffic, and the British Council in South Africa. Dr. Chasi is passionate about facilitating deeper understanding and connections between diverse people and institutions by creating space for critical engagement and constructive dialogue. Her current research interests lie in Global South perspective on higher education internationalization, with a particular focus on South-North partnerships and decolonial approaches. Dr. Chasi holds a Doctor of Philosophy in Education from the University of Wits, Johannesburg, a Master of Philosophy in Engineering Management from the University of Johannesburg, and a Master of Arts in English, Russian, and Sociology from the University of Rostock, Germany. Please, Samia, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Bom dia. Eu sou Samia e estou muito feliz em estar aqui. Good morning. I'm Samia, and I'm very happy to be here. Thank you so much, Celso, for this very kind introduction. As mentioned, I represent FAUBAI's sister organization in South Africa, the International Education Association of South Africa, or short, IEASA. Recently, I was the only South African delegate at an international meeting, and a lot of responsibility rested on my shoulders. Today is a little bit different because I'm not alone. There are some colleagues here with me from South Africa, from universities that are member institutions of IEASA, and I would like to acknowledge them. I can see two right in front of me in the audience. I don't know where the others are, but we have Leoland Jackson, who is based at Central University of Technology, and he's also a past president of IEASA. We have Dr. Shanice Subramani from Northwest University, and we have Moses Petersen from the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. And last but not least, we have Mr. Lebete Malefo from the University of Johannesburg. So perhaps they can all wave so that you can know who and where they are. Thank you. I bring you greetings from the IEASA president, Dr. Laverne Samuels. He's not a stranger to FAUBAI, but unfortunately he can't be here this year. I think he's attended 5 conferences, and he has very close links and friendships with the FAUBAI community. So he sends his very warmest regards, not only in his capacity as IEASA president, but also in his capacity as the current chair of the Network of International Education Associations, or short NIA, of which both IEASA and FAUBAI are members. Please allow me to start with a few thanks. I would like to express my deepest gratitude to FAUBAI for affording me this wonderful opportunity to not only attend the conference, but to make an active contribution as a speaker today. It truly is an honor and a great privilege. I would like to thank specifically a few people in person. First of all, Prof. José Celso-Freire, thank you so much for inviting me. Prof. René Sigman and Prof. Nicolas Meillard, thank you so much for taking the time to meet with me and to prepare for this talk. And then also thanks to Carolina Martoni for making all the logistical arrangements. And she also helped me, learn that little bit of Portuguese that I started off with just this morning. The theme of this year's FAUBAI conference is Inviting for a New Journey. I think this is a wonderful topic, and it's also very relevant to me personally, because being here is a new journey for me in more ways than one. Firstly, when I came here from Johannesburg, it was the first time that I used LATAM Airlines, and I must say it was a very pleasant journey. Secondly, this is the first time that I'm visiting Brazil, and I'm happy that I get to know this country and its people a little bit better during my stay here. Thirdly, this is the first time that I'm giving a keynote at a conference of an international education association in front of such a big audience. That makes me a little bit nervous, but those who know me know that I generally do not shy away from a challenge. So here we go. The topic of my talk is Reimagining Internationalization from the Global South. For me, this is a very exciting topic. It speaks directly to the very heart of the work that I do in international education. And as I'm standing here in front of you today, I'm delighted that I have this opportunity to be able to share with you some reflections on what a new journey might mean in the context of our work in international education. The first question we might want to ask is, why is reimagining internationalization from the Global South a relevant and an important topic for a gathering like this? Perhaps the short answer is because the modern world is dominated by northern perspectives, and internationalization is no exception. Perhaps because internationalization, as we know it, brings with it many challenges, especially when we consider it from the contexts and experiences and lived realities of people and higher education institutions in the Global South. Because our international relations are very often not symmetrical, not equitable, not mutually beneficial, and not inclusive. So what then does reimagining mean? First and foremost, I think it means to think differently, from a different starting point. In the context of higher education internationalization, I think it means to think critically about the present, the past, and the future of internationalization. So criticality here is absolute key. We heard yesterday in Eugenio's plenary what happens when criticality is not encouraged or not even allowed. Well, I'm happy to tell you that when it comes to decolonization, criticality is a requirement. Decolonization provides a space in which we can and must be critical. And I think that relates well to the notion of the Global South as a different point of departure. In an article titled Thinking About the Global South, Affinity and Knowledge, Dilip Menon referred to the Global South as an invitation to imagine the world afresh. So let's think for a moment about what this means. What does it mean to imagine the world afresh? More specifically, since I am talking to you, what does it mean to me? It means to start from where I am. In the words of Paula Moya, it's important to know, and I quote an article that she wrote, who we are and from where we speak. So when I'm not here in Sao Paulo, I'm in Johannesburg in South Africa. So the work that I do is from the perspective of South Africa as a representative of the Global South. It means that the work that I do is informed by South African experiences and realities. And it also means that my work is informed by decolonial perspectives on higher education in general and internationalization in particular. So I would like to take you now on a little journey of that work, and I hope that it will offer you something that you can relate to, something that makes sense, something that perhaps even can be inspiring. As Celso mentioned, I've been a practitioner in international education for 25 years. My first job I started in 1999 in the international office of my home university in Rostock in Germany. My life as a scholar in international education has been much shorter. It only started when I embarked on my PhD journey, which ended with my graduation in 2019, so that was only 5 years ago. As part of my doctoral research, I looked at North-South partnerships in higher education. I came to this topic as someone who is of European and African descent, someone who was born and educated in the North and worked in the South. I came to this topic as someone who had been working in the field of international education for a long time, promoting and facilitating international collaborations of universities in a variety of organizations. Celso mentioned some of them. But specifically, I came to this topic as someone who was really irked by the inequalities and the asymmetries that I experienced as a representative of a South African university, particularly in engagements with our counterparts in the global North. So I decided to dig a little bit deeper and to do and dedicate my PhD on this topic. Now, during the time while I was busy with my PhD, I, like everyone else in South Africa, lived through the student protest movements of 2015 and 2016. They have widely become known as #FeesMustFall and #RoadsMustFall movements. Students took the lead in critiquing higher education and demanding change. They demanded the removal of the statue of Cecil John Rhodes from the campus of the University of Cape Town, a man who they said was undeniably racist, imperialist, colonialist, and misogynist. So the removal of the statue of that man is what gave the movement its name, Rhodes Must Fall. But the students made it very clear right from the start that, and I quote, "The removal of the statue will not be the end of this movement, but rather the beginning of the decolonization of the university." So the students put decolonization on the map. It became then and has been ever since a pertinent issue for South African higher education. And the students began to influence my work because I decided to then take a decolonial approach to better understanding the North-South partnerships I was looking at and as part of my PhD. And I've continued to use a decolonial lens in my work ever since. So when I did my PhD as a part-time student, working in an international office and at a couple of other organizations, it was to a large extent a very lonely journey. So I'm using this journey metaphor again. It was lonely because I only had time to do my research in the evenings, over weekends, during the holidays, and I wasn't really part of a close-knit academic community. But it was also lonely because I didn't have too many colleagues at the time who were interested in researching similar topics. But then a few years ago, luckily, all of that changed because I met a colleague who joined me in this journey. He became a travel companion, so to speak. In fact, we had known each other for a few years working in the South African higher education sector, but for some reason, we had never really shared our views and perspectives on the field. The person that I'm referring to is, of course, Celso mentioned him, Dr. Savo Heleta, who works at the Durban University of Technology in South Africa and is also a member of IEASA's governing body, our council. So Savo and I started working together in 2022. We've now co-published 3 papers, and there is one that I will specifically draw on for the next part. This is a paper that we co-authored when we realized that we both had an interest in interrogating the very definition of internationalization. So the article that I'm referring to is called Rethinking and Redefining Internationalization of Higher Education in South Africa Using a Decolonial Lens. It was published in 2023. In this paper, we start from the assumption that internationalization, as it is commonly defined, does not speak very well to the South African context of higher education, where our universities were established in the 19th century as colonial institutions to serve the needs of British and Dutch settlers, where higher education has to address the legacies of colonialism and apartheid by focusing on transformation of the sector, where the curriculum, to a very large extent, to this day remains very Eurocentric. So we posit in our paper that the definition of internationalization, which hasn't really changed much in the last 30 years, needs revisiting. We argue that when internationalization is essentially understood as the, and I quote, integration of international, intercultural, and global dimensions into the purpose, functions, and delivery of post-secondary education. I know you are all familiar with that definition. Goes back to Jane Knight, and of course David and Hunter also updated it about 10 years ago. But this definition does not really resonate well with South Africa, where much of higher education is colonial and therefore arguably inherently international. So the conversation is not about integrating international perspectives and global perspectives. It becomes much more a conversation around how can we include local perspectives, African perspectives into the curriculum, for example. So in South Africa, some of the questions that we're dealing with are, why are our curricula white? Are our universities of our institutions of higher learning universities in Africa? Or are they African universities? How do we bring internationalization into conversation with transformation, decolonization, and Africanization? So it's against that backdrop that Savo and I attempted to redefine internationalization of higher education in South Africa using a decolonial lens. And I'd like to share the definition with you. I will read it out in its entirety. It's quite a mouthful. Here it comes. Internationalization of higher education is a critical and comparative process of the study of the world and its complexities, past and present inequalities and injustices, and possibilities for a more equitable and just future for all. Through teaching, learning, research, and engagement, internationalization fosters epistemic plurality and integrates critical, anti-racist, and anti-hegemonic learning about the world from diverse global perspectives to enhance the quality and relevance of education. So this, thank you. So this definition aims to acknowledge that universities engage with the world as a highly complex, unjust, unequal, and divided place. It also aims to speak to issues of positionality, criticality, and plurality, which are, in our understanding, core elements of what it means to take a decolonial approach to internationalization. And this definition is responsive to and informed by the South African context, but it does not aim to be the South African definition. That's very important. It's now been 2 years that this definition has been in the public domain, and we've had a number of very interesting engagements with colleagues from around the world. I want to share just a few. So in South Africa, some of our colleagues find this work important and relevant, and others cannot relate to it at all. They don't know why we are doing what we are doing. Some colleagues in Canada have told us that they can identify with our definition as it speaks to their context where they are working in internationalization and decolonization with a strong focus on indigenization. And so there was something in that definition that they could take into their context and make it make sense. In the United States, one colleague from a university in Florida said that while he can personally relate to our definition, he will never be able to use it in a work context because he can't mention internationalization in the same breath as racism or equality, diversity, and inclusion because of the current political climate. And perhaps not surprisingly, a few colleagues from Latin America have shown great interest in this definition, and particularly in comparing our perspectives. Given our shared histories of colonialism, I think that makes perfect sense. So coming back to the topic of my talk, reimagining internationalization from the perspective of the Global South, it is about rethinking it. It's about concepts and definitions, and the one that I presented here is one example of theorizing from the Global South. But it's important that it's really just that, just one example. Savo and I point out in our paper that everybody who reads it needs to engage with it critically. We cannot accept that it might be relevant and equally valid in different contexts in the Global South. It is informed by the South African context. But reimagining is not only about the theory of internationalization, it's also about practice. So it's not only about thinking differently, it's also about doing differently. Celso, you said yesterday in your opening remarks that sometimes there's not enough action for you. So I want to share some thoughts on what practical implications of reimagining internationalization from the Global South might mean. And I hope that I can touch on a number of aspects and areas in our work that you are all involved in. So I want to talk first about international partnerships, and a practice there that we really need to very critically reflect on is that of student mobility. From the perspectives of countries where such exchanges are often not beneficial for our institutions because they're not reciprocal, we receive students, but we can't send students out. In internationalization scholarship and literature, you will find that student mobility partnerships are often referred to as the most popular, the most common model of internationalization. But when we look at this deeper, we realize that this is from the perspective of the North. It's from the perspective of institutions in Europe and in North America who are looking for study abroad places for their students. It's not the reality in the Global South. It's not our truth. So we, and I'm talking about all colleagues in the Global South, need to take a stand about this and not get involved in partnerships that we feel are not beneficial for us. And we need to find ways to make sure that in any partnership, not just a student mobility partnership, our interests and needs are actually met. When it comes to research collaborations, we have to be extremely critical also of existing norms and practices. We really can't take anything for granted. In 2022, I had the pleasure of co-chairing a session on decolonizing science at the United Nations General Assembly Science Summit. One of the speakers in our session was Professor Aline Giladi, a paleontologist at the Federal University of Rio Grande do Norte. She spoke about the phenomenon of parachute science, where people come to Brazil to remove fossils, sometimes legally, sometimes not. These fossils are found here, but they are taken away to be studied and analyzed in European institutions and to be published about with little or no involvement of Brazilian scholars. And so Aline has been very vocal about this harmful practice. She's been involved in campaigns to bring these fossils back to Brazil. Because not only do practices like parachute science deprive the Brazilian people of an important part of their heritage, they also deprive Brazilian researchers of an opportunity to practice and develop their science. At the IEASA conference in 2022, a few colleagues and I offered a workshop that we called Tackling Power Imbalances and Inequalities in International Partnerships and Collaborations. We used Linda Tuai Terina Smith's critical questions, which she posed in 1999, developed in the context of Indigenous education in New Zealand. And these questions, I think, are very important and relevant in this context because they are as follows. Whose research is it? Who owns it? Whose interests does it serve? Who will benefit from it? Who has designed the questions and framed the scope? Who will carry it out? Who will write it up? And how will the results be disseminated? If we pay attention to all of those questions in our engagements and our research collaborations, I think we can move towards different practice and a different future. When it comes to the curriculum, it's about tackling Eurocentrism and epistemic hegemony. It's about interrogating whose knowledge is included in the curriculum and why. In our most recent article, Savo and I tackle a few of these issues. Our article is called Curriculum Decolonization and Internationalization, a Critical Perspective from South Africa. And we pose a few questions for people who work with curriculum, and especially those that decide what goes into the curriculum, what gets legitimized in terms of the formal curriculum in our universities. And so some of these questions are the following. I will share them with you as they are. Whose knowledges, perspectives, and worldviews are centered, dominant, valued, recognized, and legitimized in the curriculum, and why? Whose knowledges, perspectives, worldviews are neglected, marginalized, or erased in the curriculum, and why? How does the curriculum relate to the students? Does it speak to their lived experiences and realities? How can we foster plurality of knowledges and help students learn about historical and contemporary realities, inequalities, and injustices in the world? How can we ensure that international perspectives in the curriculum are truly international, encompassing diverse knowledges, worldviews, perspectives, and ideas from around the globe based on epistemic pluralism? The last example that I want to just touch on is global citizenship, and particularly global citizenship education as a mandate and a mission of universities. We need to reflect very critically on what we mean by this and what a global citizen, in fact, is. According to UNESCO, a global citizen is someone who understands how the world works, someone who values differences in people, and who works with others to find solutions to challenges that are too big for any one nation or institution or country to solve. And I would like to introduce you to a critical framework from South Africa, which is called Critical Diversity Literacy. So this is a framework that was first developed by Melissa Steyn, and the most recent article she published together with a colleague, Van Joro, it's called Critical Diversity Literacy, a Framework for Multicultural Citizenship Education. That framework is something that they posit for citizenship education in contemporary heterogeneous societies. They assume that difference is related to power and privilege. They've posed 10 principles. I'm not going to go into all of them, but they really show the interrelatedness of the issues that we are dealing with. And of course, their approach to multicultural citizenship focuses ultimately on social justice. So what I've shared here with you are some examples from the South, South Africa, and elsewhere. They concern mostly engagements between the global South and the global North and how we can bring about change. But as one of my PhD research participants said, we can't just focus on the global North if we want to bring about change. Rethinking the partnerships paradigm in particular has to be, and I quote, premised on a principled, honest, confident engagement with universities in the South. This includes creating an intellectual agenda that works with our traditions of thinking, our traditions of philosophical reflection, our histories, our particularities. Yesterday, I visited the Afro-Brazil Museum here in Sao Paulo. It's an impressive testament to, and they say this on their website, the importance of African people in the formation of Brazilian culture, heritage, and identity. It's a powerful and beautiful expression of our shared history. So when we take that into the context of internationalization, when we deal with issues of coloniality and decoloniality in higher education, we cannot do that without paying attention to the work of contemporary African scholars, such as Sabelo Ndlovu Gacheni, for example. But we also cannot ignore important voices from the Americas. And I want to mention just two of them, Walter Minolo from Argentina and Nelson Maldonado Torres from Puerto Rico. And I'm naming them specifically because they have very strong links to South Africa, and I've had the very good fortune to be in some of their lectures. As international educators, we can foster a much more deliberate exchange and collaboration between different countries in the global South. And we can look at this at many different levels. At the level of individuals, for example, we can collaborate with like-minded colleagues and scholars. We can try to advance scholarship in internationalization from the perspective of the global South. I want to just give you an example of how easy it is and how wonderful it is to be in a space like this. Yesterday at the cocktail, I met Carla from the Internationalization Hub Brazil. Carla, I don't know if you're in the room. There you are. And we started talking and we discovered that we share common interests in using decolonization as an approach to look at internationalization from the perspective of Brazil and South Africa. So we said, maybe we need to get together and write a paper about it. And now, of course, that I've mentioned it here, I think the pressure is on, we have to do it. At the level of universities, we need to put more emphasis on working with partners in the global South. For South African institutions, this means working more closely with other institutions on the continent. My colleague Lebete from the University of Johannesburg spoke about this in a parallel session this morning. He shared insights from a study abroad program that is called Africa by Bus, that takes South African students to experience the continent. At the level of education institutions like FAUBAI and IEASA, there are a few things also that we can do. Last year, for example, we worked with our colleagues at FAUBAI and ABRUEM to facilitate a visit of a delegation of Brazilian rectors to South Africa. This was a mission that was aimed at fostering exchange and dialogue between Brazil and South Africa. I'm also very happy to announce that IEASA has recently entered into a dialogue with our Colombian sister organization. There is a representative of RCI here present, Patricia. If you want to wave, thank you very much. We have been talking about how we can foster deeper engagements between universities in our two countries, and we are busy writing a proposal for joint funding. Hopefully it will be granted, and then we can set out and do what it is that we want to do. Later this year, we will host the third global dialogue in South Africa, 10 years after IEASA hosted the first one in 2014. This dialogue is an initiative of the Network of International Education Associations, And I want to call on all the representatives of Global South associations to use this as an opportunity and a platform to make Global South voices heard. I'm going to start wrapping up and concluding the speech. Based on what I've said, it perhaps seems that reimagining internationalization from the Global South is a possible task, but it is most certainly not an easy one. We live in challenging times. Today is World Earth Day, and we have to acknowledge that we are facing a planetary crisis. We live in a polarized world. We are experiencing numerous conflicts and wars around the globe. We are witnessing significant geopolitical shifts. We're living in many societies where nationalism and populism are on the rise. We are working in a sector that faces many challenges. The very essence of universities and what they have to offer to students and societies is, if not under threat, then under review. At this point, I'd like to squeeze in a little advertisement. The upcoming IEASA conference will have as its theme, Navigating Internationalization in Challenging Times. So I hope that some of you can join us in August in Johannesburg to discuss this further. Living in challenging times is certainly not easy. Doing decolonial work, or any inclusion work for that matter, can be quite daunting and exhausting because it involves challenging the status quo, which means that we will be met with resistance and we will have to come hurdles and obstacles put in our way. It requires us to go beyond what we know and beyond what we do. Eugenio spoke yesterday about the need for us to be creative and to think differently and to do differently. And it also requires us to be willing to face what is uncomfortable, the things we don't always want to talk about, particularly not in public. And it certainly requires us to do the work and to put in the hours. Eugenio said yesterday that thinking is very hard work. Doing is arguably just as hard. At times, all of that can be quite overwhelming, and we might feel that we're not getting anywhere. If that is the case, and that's how you feel, I'd like to offer an African proverb as a source of encouragement and inspiration. It goes like this: if you want to move mountains tomorrow, you must start by lifting stones today. So if we want to reimagine internationalization from the Global South, and we want to play our active part in bringing about a better, more inclusive, socially just future for everybody, what are the stones that we can lift today? Can you think about that for a moment? Which stones can we lift on our own, where we are, in our regions, our countries, our cities, towns, villages, our universities, our departments, our teams? And then the next question is, which stones can we lift together? And how can we start pushing that proverbial mountain and bring about Global South perspectives, experiences, lived realities, knowledges, and wisdoms to the global stage? Because that is what internationalization is about, isn't it? Some of my colleagues flew here with South African Airways, and South African Airways has a slogan that says, bringing the world to Africa and taking Africa to the world. If we take this into our context of internationalization, I think it means connecting the global with the local and vice versa. We are generally quite good at connecting the global with the local. Colonization did that for us. But there's much to do in connecting the local to the global. And in reimagining internationalization from our Global South perspectives and then taking them to the global stage, I think that is where new journeys truly lie. Thank you. Obrigada.
It's okay. Por favor, você pode acender a luz do palco? Do auditório? Thank you. Obrigado. Thank you for our excellent reflections, your ideas on internationalization, internationalizing higher education, encapsulates not only the essence of our work, but also propose a vision for the future of education and society that I really appreciate. You have shown that through teaching, learning, research, and engagement, internationalization becomes a powerful tool for fostering epistemic plurality that is very rare in our days, embracing diverse perspectives and dismantling oppressive structures. And we have it all around the world. Through this lens, we can truly enhance the quality and relevance of education, empowering learners to become agents of positive change in their communities and beyond. And I believe this is essential for really change the world as we want. We now have a moment for the audience to exchange ideas with you, Samia. For this, our assistants have microphones that can be used for questions. Please raise your hands as they bring the microphone to you. Any question? We have one at the end, after Olivia here.
Olivia can be the first one. We respect the elders.
Please introduce yourself.
Okay, Olivia can be the first one, I think.
Who is the other one?
You can be the first one, lady.
The youngest one. Go ahead.
You're my elder. You have my respect.
Okay, I do. Ladies first. Congratulations. Listen to you was very much inspiring. Many of the times you're talking about, internationalization and global from the South. We could change the word Africa to Brazil or to Latin America. Our realities are much more closer than we can imagine. Actually, you touch me a lot. I would like to read your test. And it's not a question, it's just a comment, okay? Is how difficult is for all. First of all, you brought some thinking about internationalization. We talk a lot about practice, what to do, what not to do, being responsible, being citizens, etc., etc., etc. But you came deeper in your reflection. I think this is something that we all lack of, thinking about not practices of internationalization, but about the spirit of it from our global South point of view. That's why I would like to read your test, not only because your thoughts, but many other authors you mentioned that was impossible to get names. And now is the provocation, not the question. So we learned all those years how to do internationalization, and we think very much like you, but we know it's not easy. It's not easy. Everybody here can do like this, It's very complicated because the North offered to us much more facilities than our colleagues from the South. And your reflections brings lights on this. But, actually, we would like to change many positions from one day to the other. And I don't know what to do. Thank you very much again.
Any comments? You have a mic.
Yes, I think it's working. Well, thank you very much for your feedback. I think what we can perhaps do also is share some of the references that I had as a reading list. And then you can hopefully find a way to make that available. So thank you very much for sharing your reflections. I'd like to offer, just in terms of a response, a few thoughts of my own, if I may. The thing that you mentioned about the North and about the resources and facilities and the inequalities that we have from there, that was a very big component of my PhD and why I wanted to, to understand how can we work in these kind of contexts. And I give you just one example. One of the people that I interviewed was a microbiology professor who at the time had a very strong relationship with a partner in Belgium. And she reflected on the inequalities just in terms of resources and time that were involved in that engagement. So she says, I am here as a professor, but I also have a teaching load. I teach 600 undergraduate students, 50 master students, and a couple of PhD students that I supervise. Her Belgian counterpart had no teaching load, was a research professor. She said where she worked in her school was the old broom closet of the school, some little dark room that somebody found and said, this is now your laboratory. When she went to Belgium, her counterpart had what she called a corridor of state-of-the-art facilities with a team of research assistants and people who would help write reports and things like that. She did all of that work on her own, mostly over weekends, in the early morning hours, etc. And what is interesting is that both these people compete for the same spaces in university rankings. And nobody asks the question, which context do you work in? It's all about your output, how many publications, how many partnerships, etc. But then there were also a few colleagues in South Africa at the university that was my case study institution who said, but that's the thing where we are wrong. A partnership is not only beneficial if we bring the same things to it. So we can acknowledge that our northern partners, and by the way, of course, I think we're going to talk a little bit more about the complexities of using these terms, North and South, because we know that not everybody in the North is resourced, and we know that not everybody in the South is underprivileged. So we understand that. But, for argument's sake, for this conversation, let's just keep using global North and global South as kind of like binaries. But there were a few of them who said, for example, we need to acknowledge that we don't bring the money, but we bring other things. We bring criticality, we bring our experience, we bring academic rigor. And that is also something that needs to be valued in a partnership if we have an understanding that everybody is bringing something to the table, but it doesn't have to be an eye for an eye. Yeah, it has to be asymmetrical. We have to find ways of making these engagements work.
Me here. Samia, first of all, I'm thrilled by your keynote. I think this is something that many people here felt about your keynote. What is interesting about what you said right now, which was about my question, is that we sometimes see those facilities following a colonial lens because those facilities are under the rules from the global North. So my question here is more about the rankings and ratings about our universities, because one of the pathways of critiquing how internationalization is so colonial is that we are evaluated and assessed by the global North. And sometimes we want integration with global North universities to get the spirit of what to be an international university, but not clear to us what's our identity. So thanks so much, because you brought your voice from one of the aspects we Black scholars, including those who are head of international affairs departments or offices in Brazil, we're seeking is that, first of all, we have to connect the local spirit we have with our interculturality, because we're intercultural. That's the spirit, the first spirit of internationalization that comes from our ancestors. And secondly, we have including scholars in Brazil who don't consider pre-colonial experiences of universities that we had in Africa, in pre-colonial Africa. I've been working a lot with South African universities, as I told you yesterday, and my question is, how can we speak from our locus of enunciation to question a little bit more these rankings and the way we need funding, of course, we need to have collaboration, strong collaborations, but how can you question from our locus of enunciation as decolonial theorists and those who have decolonial spirits? And how do you see the integration of English language from South Africa and many other universities or countries in South Africa with Latin American universities and universities outside of the US and English speaking country universities? So that's my question, and thank you so much for your very strong decolonial turn you brought. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. There was quite a lot in what you said, and thanks for sharing your perspectives. Perhaps I will touch on two things: the issue of the rankings and the issue of English as a medium of communication, instruction, dialogue, etc., etc. So let's look at the rankings. I think, you know, there's no one-size-fits-all kind of approach to look at them. And I think to some extent we are in quite a dilemma, because in the Global South we often criticize, we find it quite easy to criticize these rankings, to say from a South African perspective, for example, for a long time to say they don't reflect our missions. Not all our universities are research-intensive universities where we have all these wonderful outputs about co-published papers and these kind of international partnerships, etc. Some of our institutions are teaching institutions. And how do you measure that? How do you measure community impact, community engagement? It's changed a little bit in the past years, of course, but that was never really a criterion for university rankings. So there was a lot of criticism that we don't feel reflected in the methodology and the approach to these rankings. Then the question is, what do you do with it? And that's another dilemma, because many institutions still use them, you know, especially in terms of their advertising and marketing and communication about internationalization, because we want to all be world class. We all want to be in the top 100, top 200, top 500 of universities, and to understand that that is simply not possible in any case. So perhaps we can invest our effort and our time and our energy somewhere else. But then there are also those institutions who go a step further and opt out of the system. One of the universities in South Africa, Rhodes University, deliberately said, we are not participating in ranking exercises. It just is not something that relates to our values, and we won't do it. And of course, you all know that not so long ago, a very prominent Swiss organization and institution decided to do exactly that. So perhaps, you know, the answer is somewhere in between. We have to find different ways of engaging. Critiquing, critically reflecting, analyzing is one thing. Perhaps we really also have to engage, you know, all the different organizations that are responsible for these rankings. We know, of course, that it's a commercial exercise to a large extent, but perhaps there are things that we can do to shift the dialogue and shift the communication about them a little bit. Come up with other ranking, you know, models, for example. That could be a good conversation to be had, I think, how we could go about that. And then the issue that you mentioned about language. I think I have been thinking about that a lot, because I don't speak Portuguese, apart from the little bit that I offered this morning. And I realized being here, I arrived on Friday evening, that I have for a very long time not been in a context where I can just assume that I can easily communicate in English. So I've had people in the hotel who don't speak English, taxi drivers who don't speak English, and I thought, oh, you know, I have to think differently about communicating. And of course, the wonderful thing is that you always find a way to communicate. I mean, especially at that level where we don't have to write academic papers together or something like that. But it is something that, you know, kind of like occurred to me, that we take English for granted, I think, in most of our engagements. And what does this mean? But of course, English as a colonial language has a special place in that sense in South African higher education as well. It really is the most commonly used language of instruction in South African universities. My colleague Lebete mentioned this morning that South Africa has now 12 official languages. We had 11 official languages, of which English is one, but now we have added sign language as a new official language, which is an interesting development, I think, in South Africa. But when it comes to higher education, most of our engagements, most of our teaching, most of our research, most of our publications are in English. And of course, people do it because they want to be most widely read. But it has some serious implications from a decolonial perspective, and I just want to share an example. In 2018, there were a number of articles in the local media about the University of Fort Hare, which is located in the Eastern Cape province of South Africa, where isiXhosa is the most widely spoken local language. And the articles that made it into the paper were that in 2018, for the very first time, a PhD student at the university had published a thesis in that local language. 102 years into the existence of that institution. Can you imagine that? Think about that. Think about what that would mean in your own context. It would mean a foreign language that many of the learners are only exposed to at quite a later stage in their life. Many South Africans easily speak 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 of those official languages, but English often comes quite late and is connected to formal education, schooling, and most certainly university. So what does this mean to write a PhD in a language that is essentially not your own? And to be the first one to do it. And now imagine what happens with this thesis. Who can read it? Who can engage with it? You know? So these questions about language are going to the very core of what it means to decolonize education. Thanks.
Thank you, Samia. Thursday, I received at UNESP a delegation from UK, and the Pro-Vice Chancellor told me, I don't know if on the room, but he was having a discussion with someone from Brazil, from the northeast part, and they were talking about language. And we have more and more in Brazil programs to include indigenous people in our programs. And some of the discussions were, before talking in English, some of them, they just need to talk in Portuguese. Then it comes in some way to your reflections. I believe we have here a question.
Yes. Hi. Thank you for taking my question and for the very eye-opening presentation. My name is Rachel Marola. I'm a professor of education policy at a university in Mexico City called the Center for Research and Teaching in Economics, though I'm originally from the United States. I really enjoyed your presentation. It made me think a lot about some sessions I attended in the morning that were looking more at how digital technologies, in particular generative AI, could be used in teaching and international collaborations, specifically COIL. And it made me think about how, if in your perspective, I mean, your presentation was very theoretical, but from a more practical perspective, do you see some role that digital technologies could play in reimagining internationalization from the global south, and specifically diminishing some of the inequalities in the partnerships between global south and global north, increasing access to education, and increasing or decreasing some of the inequalities that are persistent and that exist? Do you have any examples, or do you see some role that digital technologies or, well, specifically generative AI could play in your work? Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. You put your finger on the one thing that I left out. Well, probably many things, but I wish I had the time to talk about it. So thanks for posing the question. We can touch on some of those things now. No, absolutely. I do think that technologies, and specifically new methodologies that use technologies, such as collaborative online international learning, have an important role to play. But they are not a panacea, for all the challenges that we face, in the sense that, yes, I think technologies can increase access and participation. And by the way, that's not only in teaching, it's also in international education conferences, for example. The third article that I didn't speak about, Savo and I wrote, was on internationalization conferences and how the move to host events online during COVID was something that increased access and participation for underprivileged and underrepresented delegates. Most of them come from institutions in the Global South, and that the move back to the old normal was actually a loss, for many of us, because now we are back to where perhaps if we are very lucky, we can afford to go to one international event a year. We certainly can't go and cover all International Education Association conferences. So I'm just saying that to say that, technology plays a role, I think, not only in teaching, but let's go back to the COIL example. COIL is something that, from a South African perspective, gained importance long before COVID. We have a project now, it's called the Ikuru project, which is an Erasmus Plus capacity building project, or was funded by the EU in that framework. And it started, thinking about using technology to create opportunities, more opportunities for students, beyond the very privileged few that can ever be mobile and have this wonderful experience of going and studying abroad, physically moving to another place. But to say in South Africa, the socio-economic realities are such that this will not even be 1% of our students, if even that. So we have to find other ways of bringing internationalization home, right? Internationalization at home, internationalization of the curriculum, and the use of technology was a very important aspect in that. So there is a project already that looks into COIL. They're going to have their closing out conference in a few weeks. So hopefully there's a lot that we can learn from that. COIL, from an IEASA perspective, is a practice that we want to promote as a practice that we feel can assist with a number of the challenges that we face, but we have to be also careful when we say that, because COVID showed us, for example, that because our sector is so diverse, and because we still in South Africa have a sector where we suffer the consequences of colonialism and apartheid, in the sense that universities were set up differently, were resourced differently. And I give you an example. One of the top research-intensive universities, when all institutions closed down, when we had a hard lockdown. South Africa was in a lockdown for almost 3 years. But the hard lockdown in March 2020, when it all hit us and borders closed and institution closed, one university managed to put their teaching and activities online in a matter of 3 weeks. 3 weeks. Other institutions, after 6 months, they were still not able to reach all their students. So that shows you that we can't assume that we can use technology if some of our students don't have access to the facilities, especially when they're not on campus, because most universities, but not all of them even, have laptop devices and computers for everybody, have internet. We have in South Africa interrupted power supply. So sometimes there's no access to electricity, then you don't have access to the internet, then you can't sit in a virtual classroom either. So those are some of the things that we have to be mindful of. And the last thing that I want to mention in that context is that when it then comes to the actual teaching using COIL, we still have to be careful about power dynamics and how we teach and how people engage. So just because we are online doesn't mean that we can't have dominance of northern perspectives in our teaching, in the curriculum. And there are a number of colleagues. We had a panel at IVEC conference where we looked at some of those dynamics, from global south perspectives. Osvaldo, for example, was there and also presented a perspective on how to use COIL in a way that it is really moving towards equitable and inclusive engagements, because it's not a given that just because you have the technology, that kind of like comes automatic. It doesn't.
Thank you. Just to remember, we have, South Africa, we started with COIL maybe 7 to 8 years ago, and we have our own program. I mean, FAUBAI, we have the BRAVE program, Brazilian Virtual Exchange program, and we have several people that I know here that participated the IVEC conference that we organized here last year in November. Then in São Paulo, in the same conference center, then they are keen to find partners to discuss possibilities for virtual exchange. I believe we have another question there. Yeah, yeah. This we should have some questions from this side. Okay.
Okay.
Yes.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Luciane Stalivieri. I'm a professor at the Federal University of Santa Catarina, and I'm also Carla's partner at the Internationalization Hub. First of all, Samia, I'd like to thank you very much for all your food for thought you gave for us this morning and for standing up for the Global South. It's extremely important. And you may know about Brazil. You know it's a continental country, how big our borders are. And my topic is, I completely identified with you just mentioned about lack of internet, no electricity, no computers. And my question is your country, your institutions in your country, are you thinking about the internationalization of fundamental education, basic education? Here in Brazil, we recently released a document named Parameters for Internationalizing Basic Education. What we call basic education here comprehends the initial schooling years of our young people. And we are very concerned about that because we have schools on the borders of the country, binational schools, bilingual schools, international baccalaureates coming very strong to start working in Brazil. And of course, we have to look at our kids. How can we really form global citizens? And not only the kids, are we looking for the professors' training? Are we forming professors to work with these young people? So the topic is your country, or you know other experience of different countries and institutions who are focusing on the internationalization of basic education? Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Now you are providing some food for thought for me. Thank you so much. I would actually love to hear more about that policy. In the South African context, that does not exist. We have, in terms of the responsibilities of our ministries, 2 separate departments, the Department of Higher Education and Training and the Department of Basic Education that looks at schooling and school education. And as far as I know, there's no such thing at all that looks at the concept of bringing international perspectives into the school curricula, topics about global citizenship for our schools, etc. So that is something that at this point in time really does not exist. What does exist is conversations around what decolonization, for example, could mean for the school curriculum. We recently, Savo and I recently had a webinar with the Cape Peninsula University of Technology in South Africa with the teacher education students and staff. And we asked them that question. We presented our paper on curriculum decolonization and internationalization, and some of the questions that I shared with you around whose knowledges are, validated through the curriculum, etc., and whose knowledges aren't. And we asked them that question, is this relevant for you? The teachers that you are, the students will be the future teachers, will be working in these schools. Is there relevance for them to take this there? And the response was quite low-key, I must say, for lack of a better word. because there was a realization that there's not much that the students can do, in the sense that the curriculum is prescribed nationally by the Department of Education. And so most of the teachers, even if they personally, have an interest or would be happy to explore, they wouldn't really find a conducive environment to go out and do that, because they would be expected to teach the curriculum as it is. And that in itself, in basic education in South Africa, is a challenge. I mean, I spoke about, the struggles that universities had when we had to move online because of COVID. In some of our schools, learners essentially lost 2 years of their lives as learners because schools were unable to provide them with education in a meaningful sense that they could really say, we've captured the curriculum for the year and we can move on. So there are massive challenges at that level, and probably those kind of conversations, many of you will know that, then those internationalization conversations kind of like get moved to the back of the queue. There are other issues that are more pressing, more important, that institutions have to deal with first. So I wish I could have told you that, there is something we can share, but in this instance, maybe we'll have to come and share with you, and you can tell us what your experiences are. Thank you.
If I may, maybe one of the stones that we should move before the movement is what's happening in Brazil, in my opinion. I'm not a specialist, but it's just international schools just coming here to teach, to form a North citizen. Then this is maybe the first stone we should move is, if they will come here, they will just understand where they are arriving, and that there is a local environment that they should respect.
Yeah, and I think that would be a very important conversation, because there the national government has a role to play as a regulatory body, for example, to say, you can come here on the condition that this is how you engage. We have interesting conversations in South Africa. For example, one of the things that we often refer to when we talk about our sector, and it's different from yours, our sector, higher education sector, our understanding is that this is public universities. We almost have no private institutions, particularly also not T&E, kind of like, branch campuses of foreign institutions or international universities. That is actually, in fact, something that the Department of Higher Education and Training deliberately worked against. And it is part of that. There was a concern that international organizations, when they come to the country, they would not understand the need for transformation. And that cannot really be expected. So in a way, they were not particularly welcomed. There were some, and many of them had to close their doors ultimately, because that's something that didn't fit. But an interesting reflection in my personal capacity, I'm also the chairperson of the board of one of the German international schools in South Africa, the school in Johannesburg. And we have these kind of conversations around, what's our reason for being here? Why do we need a German school in South Africa? How can we engage with that context, and what does this mean? And how does this shape our identity? What kind of platforms for dialogue and for engagement can we create? What does this mean for the education that our learners get here when they come to us, etc.? So all of those questions, I think, are extremely pertinent at all levels of education.
Thank you. We have a last question from this side of the audience. Then.
Hi, my name is Hassan Iqbal. I have a very particular concern with the title, which is very much appreciated title, because I'm born in Pakistan. I lived in Pakistan until 26th of my age, and last 16 years I am living in Peru. So both are part of the global south. So what I'm concerned about working in the both continent in education, that global south is missing an identity. And whenever there are talks about internationalization, globalization, so for solutions, they are looking forward, or they are exploring from global north. So that means there are still underestimation, prejudices, stereotypes, or lack of identity. So what could be the single identity that you recommend or you feel that the initiatives can start from there? That single identity, I am a student of that single identity to look forward and explore it. Please.
Thank you very much for that question. I think I'm going to disappoint you because there is no recommendation that I can make. I agree with what you're saying about the importance of having that identity conversation, but it's a conversation that everybody has to have for themselves. Because you might remember when I spoke about decolonization, and some of the core elements of that are actually this element of positionality. It really depends on who you are and where you are and what your circumstances are. So they will most likely be very different, looking at a context in Pakistan, looking at a context in Peru, in South Africa, and Brazil. That doesn't mean that once we have done the work, we can then say, oh, there are some similarities here. So we can engage, we can share our experiences, we can enter into a dialogue. But the work has to start at home. And an important element, I think, in decolonial work is that agency, that we have to take on for ourselves the responsibility to do the work. And in the context of knowledge generation in universities, for example, that also means that we don't have to accept the knowledge that kind of like we easily receive. There is one example that I might share in this context. When I was doing my PhD, it was in 2018, at Wits University in South Africa, they opened the African Center for the Study of the United States. African Center for the Study of the United States. That, of course, I think comes on the understanding that a lot of the centers for African studies are actually not based on the African continent, but they are in Europe and they are in the US. So this, to some extent, was to say, no, we don't want to believe what the US is telling us about themselves. We are going to create our own knowledge about the US and our relationship with them. And that is part of a decolonial perspective, to not only accept the knowledge that you receive, but to create your own. And I think that is linked. So in that sense, that would be the recommendation. Get together, do the work, find allies, find like-minded people, find the people that you need to talk to, that you need to influence, whether they are in your associations, in your universities, in your governments, etc. And then see if you can push towards change.
Very quickly, just taking few seconds, to disclose it and remove this barrier, what is the dependence? Political dependence or academic dependence? What is your answer?
I think it's everything.
Okay.
I mean, that is part of, if you dig deep into into the concepts of coloniality and decoloniality, for example, coloniality is really about everything that we do and everything that we know. It's about our very existence. So you can't actually now come and say, I'm only going to work on this part or that part. That is unfortunately not true, which is why sometimes it becomes such a daunting exercise, because you realize the more you deal with it, the bigger the task becomes. And, hence my suggestion to say, let's identify those smaller kind of like bits and pieces, those stones that we can lift so that we can start somewhere.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let me give you, when I first read your paper with Savo, I talked to my friends, we should have Samia with us in a plenary. And I believe everyone here agrees that it was a great moment. Then, thanks a lot. It's really a great pleasure to have you here and sharing with us. And you'll be here. People can talk to you up to Wednesday. Then, thanks again. We just have a message from Nicolas, and we will close the session.
right, the message was already given. The lunch is served. So now please be welcome to go and have lunch and coffee. Downstairs on the main hall, the Salon Nobre and the Grey Hall. And please use the time also during the lunch to visit the booths which are there and enjoy the connection with everybody. Have a good bon appétit, as we say in Portuguese.
And so